Today, the Spokane Police Department announced it has identified the man who killed 9-year-old Candy Rogers in 1959.
It was possibly the most well-known cold case in the city and the entire state.
After 62 years, the Spokane Police Department stood before cameras and announced that they had finally identified the man who murdered 9-year-old Candy Rogers. It is one of the oldest cold cases ever solved in the state of Washington. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, Candy left her home in west central Spokane carrying 7 small boxes of campfire mints. She had a plan, a route, and a rule about being home before the streetlights came on. She never made it back through that door. What followed was 62 years of dead ends, wrong suspects, a DNA sample that nearly didn't survive, and a glass jar that changed everything. But before any of that, you need to know who Candy Rogers was. Because what was lost that afternoon was far greater than this case file will ever fully capture. Welcome back to Black Docket. Today we are covering one of the most extraordinary solved cold cases in American history. A 9-year-old girl, a killer who was never once suspected, and the forensic breakthrough that finally put his name on paper 62 years too late. If you are new here, hit subscribe and the notification bell. Every week we go deep on the cases that time almost buried for good. Now let's get into it. Spokane, Washington in 1959 was the kind of city where children walked to school alone, and adults did not lock their front doors. West Central Spokane was a working-class neighborhood. Modest homes, familiar faces, the kind of block where every adult knew every child by name. Nobody watched the clock when kids went outside to play. There was no reason to. The streets were safe. Everyone agreed on that. That assumption is the first thing this case destroys. Candace Elaine Rogers was born in 1950. She went by Candy. She was an only child, raised by her mother Elaine, a school teacher. After her parents' marriage ended and her father Carl left the family home, Elaine raised her daughter alone and made sure Candy never felt the gap. By every account, she succeeded. Those who knew Candy described her as warm, friendly, and quick to laugh. She was small for her age, 4 feet 4 inches tall, 60 pounds, and shy by nature around people she didn't know. But she was not timid. She had a quiet kind of confidence, the sort that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. She lived with her mother above a neighborhood grocery store, on the 2100 block of West Mission Avenue. Her grandparents lived right next door. She had a dog named Shep. Her world was contained and familiar and entirely hers. She was a 4th grader at Holmes Elementary School. She was also a Bluebird, the junior level of Campfire Girls of America. The organization gave her structure, community, and something to work toward. She took it seriously in the way that 9-year-olds take seriously the things that actually matter to them. The Bluebird program wasn't just an after-school activity. It was her identity outside the classroom. She showed up to every meeting. She took on every activity, camping trips, community service, hiking, with the kind of enthusiasm that made the adults in the room smile. Candy Rogers was growing into herself, quietly, steadily, with a whole future in front of her that everyone around her could already see taking shape. Nobody saw what was coming on March 6, 1959. March 6, 1959 was a Friday. It was also the first day of the campfire mint selling season. Candy came home from school at 3:15 that afternoon. By 3:30, she was at her troop leader's house picking up her allocation for the day. 7 small boxes of campfire mints. That was all she could carry. She was too small for more. Her goal was clear and specific. Sell enough mints to earn a sales badge and qualify for a free week of summer camp. She had already thought through her route. She knew which neighbors would definitely buy. She knew which doors to knock on first. She came home and waited. The official selling start time was 4 p.m. In that half hour, she sat with her grandmother and ate an oatmeal cookie. She played with Shep. She talked through her plan out loud, excited in the way children are when they have a mission. Elaine reminded her of the rule before she left. Be home before the streetlights come on. It was a rule Candy had always followed. Elaine reminded her every time anyway. Not out of worry, just out of habit. There was nothing about that afternoon that suggested she needed to worry more than usual. Dozens of other campfire girls were heading out that same evening, all in the same uniforms, all carrying the same small boxes. At exactly 4 p.m., Candy Rogers stepped out into the cold March air and started knocking on doors. She was excited. She was not nervous. She had no idea she was walking out of her life. In the Pacific Northwest in early March, darkness falls fast. By 5:40 p.m., the streetlights were already flickering on across west-central Spokane. When 5:30 passed with no sign of Candy, her grandfather stepped outside to look. He checked with the immediate neighbors. He walked the block. Nobody had seen her recently. Her mother Elaine arrived home shortly after from a hair appointment to find her daughter missing. Within the hour, family members were searching the surrounding streets. They asked neighbors. They retraced the route Candy had mentioned. Some people confirmed they had seen a small girl with mint boxes earlier in the afternoon. But with so many campfire girls out that evening, all in identical uniforms, nobody could say with certainty which child was Candy or exactly where she had been. By 7 p.m., police had been called. Then, at around 9 p.m., searchers found something on Pettit Drive, a road that climbs a hill the locals call Doomsday Hill. 6 boxes of campfire mints were scattered across the ground. Not dropped, scattered, as though they had been thrown from a moving vehicle. The trail of boxes led south across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood, away from her street, away from anything familiar. Candy had left home with 7 boxes. 1 was still missing. 1 box had a partial fingerprint on it. Investigators lifted it, preserved it, and sent it to the FBI. It was never identified. By 9 p.m. on March 6, 1959, there was no longer any question about what had happened. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost. Someone had taken her, and they had driven away fast. By the morning of March 7th, more than 1,200 people had shown up to find her. Marines, Boy Scouts, utility workers, mail carriers, horseback riders. All of them arrived in west-central Spokane before sunrise. A command post was set up at the intersection of Pettit Drive and the T.J. Meanick Bridge, directly where her mint boxes had been scattered the night before. The U.S. Air Force provided helicopters for aerial coverage. They had no GPS, no cell phones, no cameras. They had 6 scattered mint boxes, 1 unidentified fingerprint, and a trail that stopped at the edge of a bridge. On that same day, March 7th, less than 24 hours after Candy disappeared, a U.S. Air Force helicopter flying low over the search area struck high-tension power lines. The aircraft went down into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed: Airman Marles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 2 others survived. 3 men died searching for 1 child. The city was now grieving in 2 directions at once, and Candy had still not been found. The days that followed brought silence of the worst kind. Tips arrived from across the country, hundreds of them, then thousands. Detectives followed every lead and contacted every person with a relevant criminal history. In 1959, there was no sex offender registry, no national database to cross-reference, no rapid way to identify predators who had moved between states. Several suspects were identified and investigated. None could be connected to Candy with evidence. The search continued. The answers did not come. 16 days after Candy disappeared, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting woodchucks in the woods off Old Trails Road, approximately 7 miles from her home. Moving through trees near an abandoned rock quarry, they came across something beside a tree, a pair of small girls' shoes. They were placed there deliberately, not dropped in a hurry, not scattered like the mint boxes, placed, as though someone had set them down with intention. The airmen returned to base and reported what they had found. The shoes were handed to police, who contacted Candy's grandfather. He confirmed they looked like the ones she had been wearing the day she disappeared. The following morning, a search party arrived at the site at daybreak. Within minutes, one of the searchers noticed a small mound made up of brush and pine needles that did not look natural. He pushed the pile aside. Candy Rogers was underneath. She had been buried under branches and dead tree boughs approximately 50 yards from the road. Retired Spokane Police Captain Richard Obering was one of the officers who found her that morning. He carried that image for the rest of his life, and he was still alive 62 years later when the man who put her there was finally named. The cause of death was strangulation. The ligature used was a strip of cloth, torn from Candy's own slip. The garment she had been wearing when she left home that Friday. Her feet were bound with a second strip from the same garment. Medical examiners documented evidence of additional violations that compounded the crime. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and preserved. The investigators of 1959 had no framework for genetic evidence. DNA profiling would not exist for another 25 years. But they preserved the biological material regardless. That single decision would become the most consequential act in the entire 62-year investigation. Detectives had evidence. They had a DNA sample they didn't yet know how to use. And for 4 decades, they believed they already had their man. His name was Hugh Beon Morse. Morse was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, the kind of man who moved through the community without raising alarm. When Candy went missing, he showed up to help search. He walked those streets alongside grieving neighbors and determined investigators, looking for a little girl he may have already known was dead. He lived just a couple of blocks from Candy's home. 4 years before Candy's murder, in California, Morse had been arrested for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. An almost identical targeting pattern. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, then moved across the country committing at least 7 more violent crimes before his arrest in Minnesota in 1961. He died in a Minnesota prison in 2003, serving 2 life sentences. The profile fit Candy's case almost perfectly. Then there was the gum. Morse had a documented habit. At nearly every crime scene connected to him, investigators found grape-flavored gum. During Candy's autopsy in 1959, a detective noted a purple stain on her clothing with what he described as a grape smell. That detail, never tested, never scientifically confirmed, hardened over time into near certainty inside the investigation. For 4 decades, every detective who inherited this case inherited that assumption along with it. In 2001, Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's clothing to a forensic lab. Scientists isolated a biological sample from the preserved evidence and built a full DNA profile. The first time in 42 years that investigators had something beyond circumstantial suspicion. They tested it against Hugh Morse. It did not match. The grape stain had never been proof. The assumption had sent every subsequent investigation in the wrong direction for 4 decades. The DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database. 0 hits. Complete silence. The real killer had never been arrested for anything requiring a DNA sample. In 62 years, his name had not appeared once. Not in a tip, not in a witness statement, not in a single police report. He had been right there the entire time. There is one reason, and only one reason, this case was ever solved. Not the detectives, not the technology, not the laboratory in Texas. All of those things mattered enormously, but none of them would have worked without a decision made by an unknown investigator in 1959. Long before DNA testing existed, someone placed Candy's clothing in a glass mason jar and sealed it shut. Glass does not degrade. Glass does not absorb moisture. It does not interact chemically with what is stored inside it. That airtight seal, created with no understanding of what future science would one day require, produced a near-perfect preservation environment for 62 years. When forensic scientists eventually opened that jar, the DNA inside was not merely present. It was strong enough to build a complete profile. The investigators of 1959 could not have known what they were saving. They saved it anyway. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her parents told her about Candy Rogers, not as a news story but as a warning. Watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl. The case was woven into how Spokane parents raised children for decades after the crime. Wright grew up to become a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. In 2018, when Spokane PD began reassessing its cold cases, Candy's file landed on her desk. The timing was not coincidental. That same year, California investigators had used a technique called forensic genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial criminal who had evaded capture for 40 years. The method worked by running crime scene DNA through consumer ancestry databases, identifying distant relatives of the unknown suspect, then building family trees until investigators narrowed the search to a single person. The moment that arrest made international headlines, law enforcement agencies across the country pulled out their oldest unsolved cases and asked the same question. Spokane asked it about Candy immediately. There was a serious problem. Despite the mason jar's remarkable preservation, 62 years had still taken a toll on the sample. In 2020, Wright submitted it to a private genealogy lab. They sent it back. Too degraded, they said. Case declined. That rejection was close to the end of the road. CODIS had returned nothing. Every traditional lead was exhausted. If genealogy could not be done with what remained, the investigation was effectively finished. Then Wright heard about Othram, a laboratory in Texas that specialized in exactly the cases other labs turned away. They had developed a proprietary method called forensic-grade genome sequencing, built specifically for degraded, contaminated, and near-depleted biological samples. In early 2021, Wright contacted them and described what she had left to work with. They said they could try. She packaged what remained of the evidence, by her own description, down to the very last drops, and sent it to Texas. Othram's genealogists built a profile and ran it through an ancestry database. The results narrowed to 3 brothers, all deceased, all from Spokane: John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. Forensic genealogy cannot distinguish between brothers. Their DNA signatures look nearly identical within a family tree search. To determine which of the 3 had left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed a living relative. Only one of the 3 brothers had children. Only one path forward existed. On September 6, 2021, 62 years, 6 months after Candy disappeared, Detective Zach Stormont of Spokane PD's Major Crimes Unit picked up the phone and called a woman named Kathy. He identified himself as a cold case investigator who needed her help. Within 45 minutes, she was sitting across from him at Spokane Police Headquarters. She already knew. In the time between that phone call and that meeting, she had searched online. She had found the story of a 9-year-old girl murdered in Spokane while selling campfire mints in 1959. She walked into that building already, carrying the weight of what she suspected about her own father. Kathy volunteered her DNA without being asked. On September 8, 2021, Brittany Wright confirmed that the DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy's family than to any unrelated person in the general population. Investigators were not finished. John Ray Hoff was deceased. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no courtroom confirmation. That meant the burden of certainty rested entirely on the science itself. A search warrant was executed on September 23, 2021. John Ray Hoff's body was exhumed. The direct comparison result came back on October 1st. The probability that the DNA on Candy's clothing belonged to Hoff rather than any other person, 25 quintillion to 1. The number 25 followed by 18 zeros. The case was solved. John Ray Hoff was born on August 11, 1938, in Spokane, his own hometown. He grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. He was not a drifter or a stranger passing through. He was local, known, and present in the same community as Candy Rogers. On March 6, 1959, the day Candy disappeared, Hoff lived at 2211 West Broadway Avenue. Candy's home was on the 2100 block of West Mission Avenue, 1 mile apart. He had a petty juvenile record and had escaped from a state reform facility in 1955 at the age of 16. That brush with the system pushed him into the military. He joined the U.S. Army at 17 and was assigned to the Nike missile sites protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, the same base whose airmen had helped search for the child he killed. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane for second-degree assault. The details of that arrest are not incidental. He had grabbed a woman, forcibly removed her clothing, used strips of her own garments to bind her, and attempted to strangle her before fleeing. She survived because something interrupted him. He used his victim's own clothing to bind her. He used her own clothing to strangle her. That is an exact match to what was done to Candy Rogers. Hoff served 6 months. The Army declared him a deserter and dishonorably discharged him. He drifted between jobs, selling cutlery door to door, working at a lumber yard, putting time in at a meatpacking plant. And then there is the connection that cuts deeper than any forensic match. Hoff had a 10-year-old stepsister in 1959. She was a campfire girl. She was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the program, the older girl whose role was to guide and support her younger bluebird. She knew Candy. She cared about Candy. When Candy disappeared and the city fell apart looking for her, this girl sat beside her brother and cried. She told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. She told him how devastating it was. He listened. He said nothing. John Ray Hoff died in 1970. He shot himself in the head. The date he chose was his daughter Kathy's birthday, the day she turned 9 years old, the same age as Candy Rogers when he killed her. Whether that timing carried meaning or was coincidence, he took the answer with him. When investigators confirmed John Hoff's identity, they discovered something that silenced the room. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The child he abducted, the 9-year-old girl he strangled with strips of her own clothing, she was buried there, and so was he, yards apart, for over 5 decades. While her family visited her grave and still carried the open wound of not knowing who had done this to her, her killer lay in the same ground, in the same silence, in the same city. When Hoff's surviving family learned this, they made a decision without being asked. They arranged to have his remains moved to a different cemetery, so that Candy, as Detective Stormont put it, could have some peace. Candy's cousin Joanne, 77 years old at the time of the press conference, wiped tears from her face when she heard that. It was not justice, but it was the only thing Hoff's family had the power to give. Kathy gave a videotaped statement that was played at the November 19, 2021 press conference. She did not deflect. She did not minimize. "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives peace knowing that even though it's not really justice, because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now. And they can know it's solved." Joanne, speaking for Candy's side of the grief, said simply, "It's not closure, but at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person that did it is at least named. He may be in a grave, but he's named." Her next words were harder. They never saw him pay or die for it or whatever. They went to their grave not knowing. And that was hard. Retired Captain Richard Obering sat in the audience at that press conference. He was one of the officers who had found Candy's body on March 22, 1959, who had pushed aside that pile of brush and pine needles and seen what John Hoff had left behind. He had carried that image for 62 years. He was still alive to hear the answer. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormont, when asked how many hours had been invested in the Candy Rogers investigation across 62 years, did not give a number. "This isn't measured in hours," he said. "This is measured in careers." 3 generations of detectives had worked this file. 3 generations had handed it forward with the same unspoken instruction: don't give up on her. The last generation did not. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She wanted to earn a badge. She had a dog named Shep, a grandmother who gave her oatmeal cookies, and a whole street of neighbors she was excited to visit. A future that belonged to her by right was taken on a cold Friday afternoon in 1959 by a 19-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away and was never once suspected. A glass jar sealed in 1959 cracked the case 62 years later. Before you go, do you think John Hoff's 1961 assault conviction, where he used the exact same method as Candy's murder, should have flagged him as a suspect sooner? Or did the system simply not have the tools to make that connection? Tell us in the comments. If this case stayed with you, hit like. It costs you nothing and it helps this reach people who need to hear it. Subscribe to Black Docket for weekly deep dives into the cold cases that time almost buried for good. The next one is already waiting.
Well, Ollie contacted me. He said, "Would you mind going over to the house and checking on her?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." On the wall, these large splatters and swaths of blood. I was terrified, and I went and I called the police.
In 2021, a woman named Liz opened a cold case file that a professional DNA laboratory had already declared unsolvable. She was not a detective, she was not a forensic scientist. She was a volunteer with the Fairfax County Police Department who did genealogy as a hobby in her spare time. Parabon Nanolabs, one of the leading forensic genetics companies in the country, had assessed the case and told investigators the solvability rate was effectively 0. The DNA matches were too distant. The family trees were too diffuse. There was not enough time or money to untangle a suspect from 1,500 fourth and sixth cousins spread across multiple countries. Liz said she would give it a try. She worked for free. She worked in her spare time. She was ready to give up multiple times across 3.5 years. Then in August 2023, she sent Detective Melissa Wallace an email. "I think I found someone of interest." 4 weeks later, the man she had identified was in a police interrogation room in upstate New York, confessing to a murder he had committed 29 years earlier, a murder that had left a 2-year-old girl alone in a house with her dead mother for 2 days, and a family carrying an open wound across 3 decades. His name was Stephen Smirk. And before we get to him, you need to understand what was lost on the night of November 18th, 1994. Because to understand why Liz spent 3.5 years on this case, you first have to know who Robin Lawrence was. Welcome to Black Docket. Today we are covering one of the most remarkable cold case breakthroughs in recent years. A volunteer genealogist, 1,500 distant cousins, and 3.5 years of doing one more thing. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We go deep every week. Now let's get into it. Springfield, Virginia, November 1994. West Springfield was the kind of neighborhood where families put down roots. Quiet cul-de-sacs, good schools, houses with yards being slowly improved by young couples building towards something. Reseca Lane was exactly that kind of street. Number 8600 was home to Ollie and Robin Lawrence, their 2-year-old daughter Nicole, and a future that everyone who knew them could already see taking shape. That future ended on a Friday night when Ollie was out of the country and Robin was home alone. Robin War Lawrence was born in Memphis, Tennessee, the daughter of Robert War Sr., a World War II veteran, and his wife Jessie. She grew up during the final years of Jim Crow, the daughter of parents who had not been allowed to ride in the front of a bus or visit the city zoo except on designated days. She channeled everything she witnessed into art. Robin earned a fine arts degree from Carnegie Mellon University, one of the most demanding arts programs in the country. What she produced immediately after graduation announced her talent in a way most artists spend entire careers working toward. She was selected to sculpt the first medal for the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, which was awarded to Rosa Parks. Her father, who had spent years fighting for a country that would not fully fight for him, watched his daughter's hands create that medal. For my parents, who grew up in Memphis during Jim Crow and could not ride in the front of the bus, her sister Mary later said, that was a big deal. Robin was warm, funny, and deeply present in the lives of people around her. Her friend Lori Lindbergh, who met her in ballet class, described her as beautiful, not just physically, but in the quality of attention she gave the world. Very personable, very fun-loving, just very down-to-earth, Lori said. Robin met Ollie Lawrence in the late 1980s. He was calm and kind, the kind of man who made people around him feel at ease. They married on New Year's Eve 1989. Their daughter Nicole arrived 3 years later. By 1994, Robin was working in advertising. Ollie was an executive at an airline. They were fixing up their home, improving the yard, working on the details of an ordinary life. Nicole had recently undergone a liver transplant and was dependent on immunosuppressive medication to survive, medication she needed every single day without interruption. Robin understood that schedule the way mothers understand things that cannot be allowed to slip. Nobody who knew Robin Lawrence could name a single enemy. Not one person who held a grudge. Not one relationship that carried any weight of danger. That reality made what happened on November 18, 1994, all the more incomprehensible. Ollie flew to the Bahamas on Friday, November 18th for a business trip. Robin was home with Nicole. Investigators later established that the last known contact with Robin was around 6 p.m. that Friday evening. At some point that night, investigators believe around 9:30 p.m., someone cut the screen on the window off the back deck of the house on Reseca Lane. They climbed through, they put on a ski mask and leather gloves, they moved down the hall toward the master bedroom. What followed lasted long enough to leave 49 stab wounds on Robin Lawrence's body. Wounds on her hands where she fought back. Wounds in her back and legs. A severe gaping wound to the neck. The phone cord in the bedroom had been cut before she could use it. She had fought her way out of the bed and continued fighting across the room. After it was over, the killer went to the bathroom. He cleaned up. He left through the same window he had entered. He drove home. Nicole was 2 years old. She was alone. She had been alone since the moment it happened, wandering through rooms, finding her mother, understanding only what a 2-year-old can understand about blood and stillness and the fact that something was wrong. She placed tissues on her mother's wounds. She brought empty baby bottles. She was trying to help. She was in that house for 2 days. By Sunday, November 20th, Ollie had been unable to reach Robin all weekend. He called his friend Lori Lindbergh and asked her to check on the house. She drove over. There was no answer at the front door. She went around to the back deck and saw the cut window screen. She climbed through the same window the killer had used. Nicole came down the hall, eyes wide, no expression. Lori moved toward the master bedroom. She could see the walls from the corridor. She called 911. She rushed Nicole to the hospital. The little girl needed her medication immediately and had gone 2 days without it. Lead crime scene detective Mark Garman documented everything. The entry point, the trail through the house, the master bedroom, Robin's body, the phone cord, the blood on the walls that told the story of a woman who fought until she could not. There was no sign of robbery. Cash and jewelry were still in the bedroom. This was not random opportunism. The violence was concentrated, prolonged, and deeply personal in its intensity. Investigators suspected someone Robin knew. They turned to Ollie. He had been having an affair with a colleague, discovered as investigators dug into the marriage. The weekend his wife was murdered was the weekend he happened to be out of the country. Detectives flew to the Bahamas. They confirmed every element of his alibi. He had been on the correct flight, at the correct hotel, the entire time. With Ollie eliminated, they had very little. Then Garman noticed something in the bathroom. A washcloth on the towel rod near the sliding tub door. A small brownish stain, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. He photographed it anyway. He had it tested. The stain was blood. It did not match Robin Lawrence or anyone connected to the household. Investigators believe the killer had cut himself during the attack and cleaned up before leaving. That DNA profile went into CODIS, the FBI's national database. No match. The investigation went cold. Years passed, then decades. Robin's family lived with the open wound of not knowing. Her mother, Jessie, died without ever learning who had killed her daughter. Her father, Robert Sr., a World War II veteran, 101 years old at the time of sentencing, carried that unanswered question across a century of living. Nicole grew up without a mother. Her cousin Lauren stayed close, but they rarely talked about Robin. I didn't want to make her anxious, Lauren said. It was better left unsaid. Mary Warcowens, Robin's sister, reached the point where she told herself she had to let it go. When my mother died, she said, that was kind of like, well, she went to her grave not knowing what happened to her child. Inside the Fairfax County Police Department, the file never fully closed. In April 2021, cold case detectives Melissa Wallace and John Long were assigned to review it. They pulled the crime scene photographs. They read the reports. They looked at everything the 1994 investigation had documented. That's like your worst nightmare, Wallace said, looking at the bedroom photos. Long was struck by the violence of it. It looked brutal. The washcloth DNA was still there. Preserved, waiting. It just had nowhere to go. In 2019, before Wallace and Long formally reopened the case, Fairfax County Police had already turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology company that had helped solve multiple cold cases across the D.C. area using forensic genetic genealogy. Ellen Graytack, Parabon's director of bioinformatics, ran the washcloth DNA through GE Deadmatch and Family Tree DNA, two consumer ancestry databases that return matches showing people who share genetic material with an unknown individual. The results came back, and they were deeply discouraging. The matches were extremely distant. Fourth cousins, sixth cousins, relationships so far removed that the shared ancestor with the unknown suspect could have lived 8 or 10 generations back. Each of those distant cousins had hundreds of descendants alive today, meaning the tree of possible suspects was not a needle in a haystack. It was a needle in a field of haystacks. Parabon assessed the solvability rate and told investigators the honest truth, effectively 0. They did not have the time or resources to untangle a suspect from a genealogical web that diffuse. The DNA also indicated the suspect likely had half Eastern European ancestry, around 25% Irish, and a combination of English, Italian, and Scandinavian making up the rest. Parabon used that information to produce a DNA phenotyping composite, a facial model built from genetic predictions: fair skin, wider jaw, narrower nose, dark blue eyes, light brown hair. They generated the composite as a young adult at approximately 25 years old. Detective Wallace showed it to Ollie Lawrence on a video call, hoping it would spark a memory. It sparked nothing. The case had a DNA profile, a phenotyping composite, a solvability assessment of 0, and no path forward. That is when Liz raised her hand. Liz was a volunteer with the Fairfax County Police Department. She was not a professional genealogist. She was not a forensic scientist. She did genealogy as a hobby, the kind of patient, methodical tracing of family history that most people find either fascinating or impossibly tedious, depending on their temperament. She had the right temperament. I just felt I wanted to give something back to the community, she told investigators, and I believed that I could actually be helpful in solving some of these cases. Investigators handed her everything Parabon had generated: the ethnicity breakdown, the list of distant cousin matches, the composite sketch. They told her what they had. They told her what Parabon had concluded. She said she would try anyway. What she was working with was approximately 1,500 distant cousins. No first cousins, no second cousins, mostly fourth to sixth. People who shared a common ancestor with the unknown suspect somewhere between 4 and 6 generations back. For each of those cousins, Liz needed to build a family tree stretching back to that ancestor and then trace every descendant forward to the present day. Multiply that across 1,500 cousins. I was not certain that I could crack it, she said. She started with the most promising matches, the cousins who shared the most DNA, even if it was still only a tiny fragment. She traced their family trees backward through generations, following the ethnicity markers Parabon had established. Some lines led to Eastern Europe, some to Ireland. Some went dead within a few generations because records simply did not exist. She hit walls constantly. I was ready to give up a number of times, she said, but I kept thinking, well, I'll just finish this. Just do this one more thing. One more thing became two more things. Two became a week. A week became a month became a year, and then another year, and then another. 3.5 years after she started, Liz had something. She had identified 2 cousin matches who were not related to each other through any path she could trace, meaning their connection to the unknown suspect came through different branches entirely. If she could find the single couple where those 2 separate family trees intersected, where one branch married into the other, the unknown suspect would be a descendant of that couple. She followed both trees, she traced the branches, she searched records in Canada where some of the ancestors had settled generations ago. And then she found it. This woman on this tree married this man on this tree, she said. That was it. That was the aha moment. That was when I realized he is a descendant of this couple right here. The tree of possible suspects had collapsed from 1,500 cousins to the descendants of one couple. One of those descendants was a man named Stephen Smirk. Detective Wallace pulled everything available on Stephen Smirk. Computer programmer, Niskayuna, New York, a quiet suburb in upstate New York. Married with 2 kids in high school, nice house, and not so much as a speeding ticket on his record across his entire adult life. There's no way this is our guy, Wallace thought. Then Long found his yearbook photo from 1988, age 16. They held it next to the Parabon phenotyping composite. The jaw, the nose, the eye shape. It looked very similar, Long said. We're like, well, you know, maybe this does make sense. They cross-referenced what they knew about Smirk's history. In November 1994, he would have been 22 years old. He had been an active-duty soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, approximately 20 miles from the house on Reseca Lane. He had lived in Virginia at the time of the murder. He had no criminal record. He fit. On September 7, 2023, Detectives Wallace and Long drove 400 miles to Niskayuna, New York. When they arrived at Smirk's address, he was in his driveway taking out the trash. They identified themselves as cold case detectives from Fairfax County, Virginia. They said they were looking into a cold case from the 1990s. They asked if he would talk. He said yes. He invited them inside. The conversation that followed was 5 minutes long. They asked for a DNA swab. Smirk signed the consent form without asking a single question. No, why me? No, what is this about? No, should I call a lawyer? Stone-faced, Long said. No surprise, no fear, nothing. They packaged the swab, left their business card, and drove to their hotel. The DNA results would take weeks to process. They would not need to wait that long. Detective Wallace's phone rang. It was Smirk. He told her he was at the Niskayuna Police Department. He said he was there to turn himself in. The station was locked and he was having trouble getting anyone inside to respond. Turn yourself in for what? Wallace said. She ran to Long's hotel room. She was still on the phone. She banged on his door. He opened it. She told him they needed to go. Local officers had taken Smirk into custody by the time Wallace and Long arrived. He was ready to talk. They sat him down in an interrogation room. They had not yet received the DNA results. That confirmation was still weeks away. They needed him to provide details of the crime that only the killer would know, without being prompted. Smirk did not need much prompting. He told them he was 22 years old on the night of November 18, 1994. He had been drinking beer. He had been taking ephedrine pills, a stimulant that the FDA would later partially ban, in part because of dangerous psychiatric side effects when combined with alcohol and existing mental health conditions. He drove to West Springfield because he was familiar with the area. He had a friend who lived nearby. He entered through the back deck window wearing a ski mask and leather gloves. He said one of the reasons he had enlisted in the Army was because he wanted to kill. Wallace knew the critical question. She asked if he had been injured during the attack. He said yes. That was why his blood was in Robin's bathroom. That was why a volunteer genealogist's 3.5 years of work was about to be confirmed by a DNA match. That was the biggest confirmation, Wallace said. That was when I knew we were in business. At one point, unprompted, Smirk looked at the detectives and said, I honestly believe that if it wasn't for my wife and my kids, I probably would be a serial killer. I am a serial killer who's only killed once. A week later, forensic testing confirmed Smirk's DNA matched the blood on the washcloth from Robin's bathroom. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Smirk, 1 in more than 7 million. Liz's 3.5 years of one more thing had just closed a 29-year-old murder. Stephen Smirk was born in 1971. In November 1994, he was 22 years old and stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia. Assigned to the same military installation that sits directly across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. He was honorably discharged from the Army after his service. He became a computer programmer. He married a defense attorney named Dawn Budarak. They had 2 children. They moved to a comfortable house in Niskayuna, New York. He paid his taxes. He committed no other documented crimes. For 29 years, nothing in his external life indicated what he had done. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, who reviewed the case, noted that a clean record means nothing in isolation. The absence of a rap sheet does not mean that criminal behavior is absent, she said. It means they didn't get arrested for it. O'Toole also challenged the claim that Robin's murder was random. Smirk had brought a weapon. He had a mask. He had gloves. He went on a night the husband was confirmed to be out of the country. This was purposeful, she said. At sentencing, Smirk's own defense attorney, his wife, told the court he had been a troubled young man in 1994 with undiagnosed bipolar II disorder, struggling with alcohol and substance abuse. She said he had spent decades getting sober and building a stable life. She said he confessed because he genuinely felt remorse. His interrogation tape showed no remorse. I think what you see is 100% what you get from him, Wallace said. Arrogance, entitlement. He wanted to do it, so he did it, and that's it. Robin's family wanted a trial. We wanted the world to know what he did, Mary said. We wanted the spectacle of that satisfaction. In October 2024, Smirk accepted a plea deal for first-degree murder. Commonwealth Attorney Steve Descano said the agreement guaranteed accountability while removing the risk that witnesses' memories, now 3 decades old, would become unreliable under cross-examination. On March 7, 2025, the judge sentenced Stephen Smirk to the maximum allowed under the plea, 70 years in prison with the possibility of parole. The judge called Robin's murder among the worst in the history of Fairfax County. Smirk spoke to Robin's family for the first time. No family should have to wait 30 years for justice for a loved one, he said. I am extremely sorry for the pain and suffering I have caused. Robert Ward Jr., Robin's brother, addressed the court. The impact of this crime has been devastating beyond measure. No family should endure such prolonged suffering. Ollie Lawrence gave a statement outside the courthouse. The War and Lawrence family are grateful that justice has finally been done for the murder of our beloved Robin. Nicole, who had been 2 years old in that house, who had placed tissues on her mother's wounds, who had brought empty baby bottles in the dark, stood beside her cousin Lauren as Lauren spoke to reporters. As much as it's a sigh of relief, Lauren said, her voice breaking, we still have to live with this. It just doesn't go away. She looked at Nicole. She's strong. She stood next to me and she held my hand. Oh my God. If her mom could see us. Robin's niece Lauren, when asked how she wanted people to remember her aunt, said, creative, exuberant, very vocal, caring, a beautiful mother. Her art still exists. The medal she sculpted for Rosa Parks still exists. What Stephen Smirk took from this family, from Nicole, from Robert Sr., from Jesse who died not knowing, is the only thing that cannot be recovered. Parabon Nanolabs told investigators the solvability rate on this case was effectively 0. A volunteer named Liz said she would try anyway. She worked 1,500 distant cousins across 3.5 years in her spare time for free. She was ready to give up multiple times. She kept doing one more thing. That is why Robin Lawrence has a name attached to her murder today. Before you leave, Liz's genealogy work alone could not have confirmed the match. The washcloth that a detective almost walked past in 1994 was the piece that made the DNA confirmation possible. If Garman had not photographed that small brownish stain, none of the genealogy work would have mattered. Which detail in this case do you think was the single most important? The washcloth in 1994 or the genealogy work in 2023? Tell us below. Subscribe to Black Docket. We cover the cases where the science does what the investigation could not. New case every week. The next one is already waiting.
It survived 35 suspects. It outlived the killer himself. And for 65 years, the evidence that would finally expose a murderer sat quietly in a forgotten evidence locker. January 2nd, 1956, Great Falls, Montana. A young couple parked at Lover's Lane, their car found running, radio playing, but the seats were empty. Hours later, the horrifying truth emerged, an execution on the frozen ground. Tonight, we're reconstructing one of the longest unsolved murders in American history. We're tracking the killer who hid in plain sight and uncovering the one piece of evidence that broke the silence after 6 decades. This is the story of Patty Kalitsky and Lloyd Bogle. Great Falls, Montana, 1956. Winter didn't just visit this place, it ruled it. The cold swept across the northern plains with a brutal, relentless force. No mountains to block it, no forests to break its path. Just miles of open country where the wind could gather speed and strike with brutal intensity. Residents were used to harsh winters, but that night felt different. The temperature had plunged well below freezing. Snow patches covered the ground, and the Missouri River looked frozen and lifeless beneath a gray, heavy sky. Most people stayed indoors. But at 16, Patty Kalitsky wasn't a girl who stayed in the background. Friends described her as warm, outgoing, and popular. She wasn't someone who faded into the shadows. People noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she naturally attracted it. She laughed easily, made friends quickly, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. She was the kind of teenager who seemed destined for a bright, expansive future, a future she would never get the chance to see. Just a few months earlier, 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle had arrived in Montana from Texas. He was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base as a young airman. Like many military recruits, he was adjusting to life far away from everything he knew. The endless Montana landscape was a shock to a boy from the South. The weather was unforgiving, the winters were biting, and everything felt unfamiliar. And then he met Patty. Their connection was immediate. In a town defined by gray winters, they were an explosion of color. They shared the same taste in music, the same enthusiasm for dancing, and the same excitement about the future. In many ways, they were exactly what mid-century America imagined young love looked like: innocent, hopeful, and full of possibility. On the evening of January 2nd, the couple spent time together like they had many times before. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at the horror waiting in the dark. After spending part of the evening at Pete's Drive-In, they climbed into Lloyd's car and drove toward the Sun River. They called it Lover's Lane, a rite of passage for every teenager in town, a place for privacy, dreams, and futures. For years, it had been considered a safe haven. That illusion was about to shatter. As they drove toward that secluded area, they couldn't have known someone was crossing their path. Someone who had already decided what was going to happen. Someone whose identity would remain hidden for more than 60 years. By the next morning, silence. The families weren't panicked. Not yet. Teenagers stay out late. They make impulsive decisions. But by midday, the silence felt heavy. Calls were made, friends were contacted, questions were asked. Nobody had seen them. Nobody knew where they were. By midday, worry turned into a cold, sinking fear. Then, 3 boys exploring the riverbank found the car. It wasn't just parked. It looked abandoned. The engine was still running. The headlights remained on. The radio continued playing. Yet there was no movement inside. As they approached, the horrifying reality emerged. A body lay beside the driver's side door. The victim was Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. He was face down on the frozen ground. His hands had been secured behind his back using his own belt. A single gunshot wound to the back of his head left no doubt. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. But where was Patty? The discovery of Lloyd's body triggered immediate panic. Search teams mobilized across Cascade County. Volunteers joined law enforcement. Every road was checked, every field searched, every riverbank examined. For 2 days, searchers combed the Montana countryside, praying they were just 1 hour behind. Then, on January 4th, a county road worker made a devastating discovery. Near Vineyard Road, roughly 5 miles from the car, he noticed something unusual near a steep embankment. What he found ended any remaining hope. Patricia Kalitsky lay at the bottom. She had been shot in the head. The autopsy revealed a final brutal layer of cruelty. Patty had been sexually assaulted. The case had transformed from a double homicide into a predatory nightmare. Great Falls had never experienced anything quite like it. People locked their doors. Parents warned their children. Rumors spread like wildfire through town. Every stranger became suspicious. Every unusual sighting generated new, wild theories. Residents demanded answers. Who could do something like this? Why target 2 young people? And where was the killer now? The pressure on law enforcement became enormous. They had 2 murdered teenagers, a terrified community, and almost no physical clues to work with. Detectives began reconstructing the final hours of the victims' lives. The evidence suggested a chilling, systematic sequence of events. At some point during the night, the killer confronted the couple. Lloyd was restrained, executed. Patty was abducted. What happened during the hours between Lloyd's death and Patty's murder remains the dark, unanswered question at the center of this story. Only one person ever knew the full story, and he never told a soul. The silence surrounding those missing hours would haunt investigators for 6 decades. The case quickly became the biggest investigation Great Falls had ever seen. Leads poured in from every direction. Tips arrived daily. People reported suspicious neighbors, former boyfriends, traveling drifters, military personnel. Anyone remotely connected to the victims found themselves under intense scrutiny. Detectives chased every lead, but some seemed promising only to collapse under closer examination. What nobody realized at the time was that the real killer had already slipped through their fingers. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding in a different state. He was living his life exactly as before, only a short distance away, watching, waiting, and carrying a secret that would remain buried for 65 years. We have the victims. We have the crime. But we have a mystery that spanned 2 generations of forensic science. How does a man hide in plain sight for 6 decades? And what was the one piece of forgotten evidence that finally blew the case wide open? The investigation was only beginning. Over the next 6 decades, detectives would examine 35 suspects, investigate a future notorious gangster, and pursue countless dead ends before a revolutionary DNA breakthrough finally exposed the man who had remained invisible all along. The failure was not in the effort. The detectives of the 1950s did everything they could with the tools they had. They took fingerprints, they interviewed witnesses, they documented the scene. But forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA, no advanced ballistics, no modern digital trail. They were fighting a ghost with a magnifying glass. As the years turned into decades, the case file grew thick, yellowed with age, a monument to a tragedy that refused to fade. It was passed from one detective to the next. Every time a new technological breakthrough occurred, the file was pulled from the cabinet, dusted off, and looked at with fresh eyes. Was there something here? Something we missed. A fingerprint that hadn't been processed properly. A piece of clothing that still held a trace of the past. The killer knew this. He knew that time was on his side. as long as he stayed quiet, as long as he didn't draw attention to himself, he was safe. And that is exactly what he did. He blended into the fabric of the community. He worked, he lived, he aged. He saw the world change around him, while he remained a fixed point of darkness in an otherwise changing landscape. But even a ghost leaves a trace. The thing about evidence is that it doesn't rot. It doesn't forget. It doesn't get old and tired. It just waits. And while the world moved from the era of black and white film to the digital age, while the men who investigated the crime retired and eventually passed away, that piece of evidence, that tiny microscopic fragment of the truth, remained in that evidence locker, holding on to the identity of the person who had ended Patty and Lloyd's lives. In Part 2, we dive into those decades of failure. We look at the rise of a new suspect, the cold trails that led detectives down the wrong path, and the specific moment when science finally caught up to the past. The technology was there, the evidence was there, but it required a new generation of investigators to connect the dots in a way no one had thought possible. The truth is never truly buried. It just waits for someone to look in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. I'll see you in the next one.